Hi, my name is Sylvia. I am 30 years old, and today, for the first time in many years, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders that had been weighing me down for almost my entire adult life, because I finally paid off my student debt, which had been dragging behind me like a snake for 10 long years. The amount that once seemed almost achievable to me, $60,000 borrowed for college, gradually grew to $80,000 due to monstrous interest and late payments, and only by miracle perseverance and ruthless discipline did I manage to pay it off faster than I had once dared to hope. I calculated that it would take another 3 years, but it turned out differently because right after graduation, fate gave me a rare opportunity, a good job at a software company where my work was finally appreciated. When I left the bank today, having closed my last payment, my fingers were shaking as if I had done something incredible, and my heart was thundering in my chest like a drum. I squeezed the keys in my palm, felt the cold metal, and suddenly realized that I wanted to celebrate this moment in my own way, quietly, without witnesses. I went into a small liquor store on the corner, chose a bottle of red, allowing myself to spend more than usual, and returned to my rented apartment. There, in modest surroundings, a one-room dwelling with a neat but unremarkable kitchen, with a shabby sofa and an old table by the window, I poured myself a full glass, settled down on the sofa, and exhaled for the first time in a long time. Yes, the apartment was not luxurious, but it was mine. Paid for by myself alone, without the eternal fear that debts will swallow up my future. You will probably ask, why am I drinking alone because such an event should be celebrated in the circle of loved ones? But everything is not simple here. I don't have a really close relationship with my family, and to be honest, it didn't start today. My story goes back to my childhood, and I still feel the pain of how my parents, Marta and Gustavo, seemed to erase me from their sight when my younger sister, Elma, was born. She's 24 now, and there was always a 6-year gap between us. But the gap in our parents' love was even deeper. I've seen more than once how uneven their attention was, like night and day. I still remember one Christmas when I was 14. I was babysitting for the neighbors, and I was saving up so hard to buy presents for everyone. I was beaming with joy, imagining how they would open the packages and realize how hard I'd worked. Elma was the first to take out a gift, a box of art supplies that I thought might inspire her to do something creative. My parents gasped, praising me profusely, as if it were the most thoughtful and wonderful thing that could possibly happen. And then it was my turn. Elma handed me a cheap keychain, obviously snatched at the last minute at a dollar store. But my parents were still overjoyed. Mom clapped her hands and exclaimed, "Look how resourceful Elma is. She came up with this all by herself." I stood there with this pathetic keychain in my hands and felt my heart sink somewhere deep inside. It had always been like this. She was their pride, their little star, and I remained in the background. Over time, I got used to this role, and instead of fighting for attention, I immersed myself in my studies. I spent hours sitting over books, doing programming after school, as if I wanted to build a world where everything would depend only on my efforts and not on someone's sympathy. My dream was to go to the best universities, MIT or Stanford, where I could prove to everyone that I was worth more. I worked tirelessly, and by the time I graduated, I had grades that would open the doors to several prestigious universities. When I found an envelope in my mailbox with an offer to enroll in a technical university, not MIT, but quite decent, I was almost speechless. Moreover, I was given a partial scholarship covering 40% of the costs. All that was left was to find $60,000 for 4 years, and then I decided that my parents would definitely help, because all my life they had been telling me that education is the most important thing. I will never forget that dinner. I was shaking with excitement. I could hardly eat, but finally gathered my courage and said, I got into the technical university. My father, without looking up from his phone, said dryly, "Is it the expensive one?" I nodded, but quickly added, "I have a 40% scholarship. I only need $60,000. My mother stopped cutting meat on Elma's plate and stared at me as if I had said something outrageous. 60,000, Sylvia? We don't have that kind of money. If you were smart enough, you would get a full scholarship. I tried to object, but my father, without looking up, interrupted. Obviously, you're not as smart as you think. Elma, who was only 12 at the time, sat next to me and smiled wryly, knowing even then that in this family her word weighed more than mine. I tried to explain, this is my chance. This computer science program opens the way to my future. I will be able to find a great job later. But my father just shrugged and went back to the screen. Then figure out how to pay for it yourself. We won't even vouch for the loan. It's too risky. I didn't give in for weeks. I brought them printouts with data on graduates' salaries, on the program's successes, but it all came crashing down into emptiness. They didn't want to listen, and this made me feel as empty inside as when I found myself holding that cheap keychain in my hands. The only person who truly supported me during that difficult period was my grandmother, my father's mother, Grandma Rosa, a woman who always stood apart from the rest of the family because, unlike them, she was in no hurry to judge, did not try to belittle, but knew how to listen and remember what was important to me, even the smallest details. When I first shared my troubles with her, told her about my parents refusing to help me with college, her face darkened and her voice shook with indignation. "These idiots," she muttered, shaking her gray head. "Don't they know what they're refusing? They don't know what a chance they're missing for you." I tried to soften her anger, lied that maybe I'd go to community college first, save up, and then figure out some way, but my grandmother wouldn't listen. "Like hell," she said, squeezing my hands in her dry, warm ones. "You did the right thing. You deserved it. You have to go, and you'll find a way." Those words seemed to inject me with a strength I had never known in myself before, and I found a way out. I took out a federal student loan that covered the entire shortfall, and thanks to the preferential terms, the first payments were deferred for 6 months after graduation, which gave me time to think it over and prepare. On the day of leaving for college, I packed all my belongings into the car, putting bags of clothes and a couple of boxes of books and notebooks in the trunk. While at the house, my parents were fussing around Elma, preparing her for some school event. Even now, I can't remember which one. It was so insignificant for me compared to my day. I stood at the front door, rang the intercom, and said, "I'm leaving." In response, an indifferent, "Drive carefully," was heard from inside. Mom didn't even come out to say goodbye, only called back a couple of minutes later and threw a short, "Okay, drive carefully," as if I was going to the store for bread. No hugs, no tears, no words of pride, just this cold routine. Elma didn't even get up from the couch to say goodbye, but Grandma Rosa was there. She hugged me so tightly that my heart sank and put an envelope in my hand, whispering, "Just in case." Inside was $200, probably all she could scrape together from her small pension, but at that moment it felt like a blessing to me. College was hellishly hard. The workload was so great that sometimes I wanted to quit, but I held on. Already in my first week, I got a job in the university computer lab, 20 hours a week for minimum wage, and even though this money was only enough for food and basic expenses, I felt like an adult and independent. To survive, I also worked as a tutor, teaching students math and programming. Between classes, work, and late-night sessions, I had little time to sleep, but I couldn't afford to relax. Losing my scholarship would be disastrous. And all this time, Grandma Rose remained my quiet rock. Every month I received a card from her with a short letter and a bill inside, sometimes $50, sometimes $100, and although these were small amounts, behind them stood her love and faith in me. Every Sunday she called me, and these calls were the only real conversations where I was asked how I was, what was new with me, what I was dreaming about, what I was afraid of. My parents behaved as if I did not exist. I myself called them on holidays, at Christmas, at Easter, on their birthdays, and on Elma's birthday. The conversations always followed the same script. "Hi, Mom, I was calling to congratulate you." "Oh, Sylvia, thanks. How are you doing at school?" Everything is fine. Dean is back on the list. That's sweet. And Elma just got elected to the student council. And that was it. The conversation was over in 5 minutes. They never asked about my major, my job, my friends, or the life I was trying to build myself. When my senior year at university began, for the first time I felt the joy of being closer to my goal. I had interviews scheduled at 3 well-known tech companies. Professors wrote glowing letters of recommendation for me, and I finally saw the light at the end of a long and painful tunnel. Graduation day was the event I had been waiting for all these years. There were families around, parents hugging their children, crying with happiness, taking pictures in front of the university buildings, and in my heart I knew that my parents would not come, but I still found myself looking for them in the crowd. The day before the ceremony, the phone rang. "Hi, honey, congratulations on your graduation tomorrow," I heard my mother's voice. "Thank you. Will you come in the morning?" I asked hopefully. There was a pause, and then she said softly, "Oh, Sylvia, I'm so sorry." Elma and I had our vacation planned. She's on spring break, and we booked a cruise a long time ago. You understand, right? I was silent for a long time, holding back a lump in my throat, and then I said, "Yes, Mom, I understand." But I didn't really understand. I just accepted. And that day, Grandma Rose was there again. She drove 4 hours alone, sat in the audience, beaming with such pride as if I'd won the Nobel Prize. After the ceremony, she took me to the most expensive restaurant in town, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a daughter who was proud of me. 3 weeks after graduation, I got an offer from Soft Dev Solutions, a starting salary of $65,000, more than I'd ever made, and the prospect of rapid growth. I was in seventh heaven. I returned to my hometown and moved in with Grandma Rosa for 6 months to save up for my own place. Those 6 months were the best in my life in years. We cooked dinners together, watched old movies, and talked about everything and nothing. And that was when I first realized that family is not always those who bear your last name, but those who choose to be around. During the time I lived with my grandmother, I saw my parents only twice, and both times their visits were connected exclusively with the fact that they stopped by to visit Grandma Rosa. Conversations at these moments were awkward and strained, as if we were strangers who accidentally ended up in the same room. "So, are you working now?" my mother asked, and I answered briefly, "Yes, at a software company in the city center." "That's good." "A stable income." She nodded, and that was where her interest in my life ended. The rest of the time, they were having animated conversations with Grandma about Elma's plans for college, as if I wasn't there. After 6 months, I finally saved up enough money to afford my own place and rented a decent 1-bedroom apartment. Grandma helped me choose the furniture, generously shared her old but sturdy dishes and kitchen utensils, and at that moment, I felt especially keenly that she was my real family. But along with this came a hard blow. The mortgage payments began. The first 6 months after graduation seemed like a reprieve from reality, but then came the day when I had to make $600 a month in payments, and the prospect of paying them off for 10 years in advance seemed like an endless road with no end. I immediately decided that I would not drag it out, would not be satisfied with the minimum payments, but would give every extra dollar in order to get rid of this bondage as soon as possible. I lived modestly, drove a used car, denied myself many things, but I knew what it was all for. Meanwhile, Grandma Rose kept me updated on family news, even when I didn't ask. I learned that Elma had gotten into State University, and not on a scholarship, but on full tuition. I remember sitting down in the middle of the room, my legs buckling under me. My parents, who had once said they couldn't afford my education, had suddenly found a way to pay for their youngest daughter's education in full. They took out a second mortgage on the house, Grandma said, and said it was an investment in Elma's future. The same parents who had called me not smart enough and refused to even co-sign my student loan had done the impossible for Elma. And this wasn't an isolated incident. As the years went by, Grandma would occasionally reveal new facts to me. When Elma turned 21, her parents gave her a brand new Honda. Then they paid for a trip to Hawaii, explaining that she had worked hard and deserved a vacation. I listened to all this and tried not to show my pain because by then I was used to their open bias. But back to the present. I was sitting alone in my apartment with a glass of wine, feeling for the first time in a long time like I had managed to get out of debt. I picked up the phone and dialed my grandmother. "Grandma, you know what? I just paid off my student loans. We should celebrate. Come over for dinner on Saturday. I'll cook all your favorite things." On Saturday, on my way to her place, I stopped at the store, bought a good wine and her favorite tuna casserole from the deli, which she always praised so much. She said she could never figure out their secret ingredient, but she loved the taste. When I got to her place, despite her fatigue, she had already set the table, set it with expensive china, and the house was filled with an amazing aroma. Grandma made stew, mashed potatoes, green beans, and even baked some buns. We sat down and began to eat, talk, and laugh as usual. And then, about 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. "Who could it be?" Grandma muttered, standing up. I heard voices and froze. It was my parents. They were talking to her in the hallway, and soon Grandma invited them in. "Excellent. Sylvia is here," I heard her say. My parents entered as if their appearance was the most natural event. Mom nodded to me. Dad said a short, "Sylvia." "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad," I squeezed out, and Mom muttered in response, "Sorry to interrupt," although there was not the slightest regret in her voice. We were nearby and thought we'd stop by. Grandma, being the polite hostess that she was, immediately began setting out more cutlery. "There's plenty of food. Come sit down and join us," she said. Mom's gaze slid over the table, china, wine, food, and she asked, "What's the occasion?" It looks like a celebration. I felt trapped because I didn't want to tell them, but Grandma looked at me expectantly, and I knew I had no choice. "I just paid off my student loans," I said. They exchanged a quick glance, the one a married couple exchanges when they understand each other without words. "Already?" Dad asked, surprised. "How did you manage to pay off your debts so quickly?" Before I could respond, Grandma intervened, proudly saying, "Sylvia works for a very prestigious company and makes a great living. She's achieved a lot." My parents exchanged glances again, but this time they didn't ask any more questions. They simply nodded and began to eat the food Grandma had placed in front of them. 2 weeks passed after that awkward dinner at Grandma Rosa's house, and I didn't hear a word from my parents, which was pretty normal for me and didn't surprise me. But one Tuesday night, as I was putting a pot of boiling pasta on the stove and chopping vegetables for the sauce, the phone rang and my mother's name appeared on the screen. I picked it up and heard her voice. "Sylvia, it's Mom. We were talking to your dad and realized that we haven't seen you in a while. We wanted to invite you to dinner this weekend, to catch up and reconnect." She said it in a surprisingly even slightly strained tone, and before I could ask for more details, she had already said goodbye and hung up. I stood there, knife in hand, looking at the phone, feeling a sense of foreboding rising inside me. Something was definitely going on because my parents never had any family dinners without a special reason. And yet curiosity overcame caution, and I agreed. On Saturday, I drove to my childhood home, and from the first steps, it felt as if time had stood still there. The same faded beige stains on the facade, the same overgrown hedges, the same crooked driveway where my father always parked his truck at an angle. I knocked on the door, although once upon a time that door had opened for me without any invitation, and that, in itself, seemed strange. "Sylvia, come in!" Mom exclaimed too cheerfully when she opened the door, and this deliberately cheerful tone was jarring. Elma was already sitting at the kitchen table, buried in her phone, scrolling through the news. When I walked in, she looked up, and her gaze immediately slid over my simple outfit, jeans and a sweater from Target. Her eyebrows rose slightly, a slight disapproval in the gesture, although she did not say anything out loud. "Hi, Elma," I said, trying to ignore her expression. "Hey," she answered shortly, without warmth. She was wearing designer jeans, probably more expensive than my entire outfit, and on her wrist was an expensive new smartwatch. The phone in her hands was also the latest model, and I couldn't help but wonder who was paying for all this. "Dinner is almost ready," Mom announced, setting out the plates. Then she looked at me. "Sylvia, tell us about your job. How are things going for you?" I tried to answer as calmly as possible. "Everything is fine. I like what I do." "Great," she nodded, but my father called from the kitchen. "Software development, right?" "That's where the money is now." "I guess so," I answered, sensing that the conversation was becoming too businesslike. My mother did not let up. "What projects are you working on?" I told her briefly, nothing extra, just to answer politely, but they continued asking clarifying questions. "How big is the company? How many people are in your department? Do you work with large clients?" I was starting to tire of this interrogation when my father said, "You must be doing well." Paying off the loans so quickly, I sighed. It wasn't easy. I just tried to live within my means and put every extra dollar toward payments. And then I saw that quick, almost imperceptible glance that my parents exchanged again, exactly the same as they had done at my grandmother's table. The conversation gradually moved on to other topics, but I clearly felt that they were watching me closely, as if trying to figure out something important. Elma, as always, couldn't resist making small jabs. "Your car is probably still old? And your sweater is cute, of course, but maybe it's time to buy something new?" She said it as if she was joking, but I heard hidden contempt in her voice. Then she asked, "So you're still renting an apartment in the city center?" "Yes, it suits me," I answered. "Isn't the rent too expensive? For that kind of money, you could buy something of your own." "Maybe someday," I said evasively, but her words stuck in my head, and again the same exchange of glances between my parents, short but very meaningful. A few days later, they showed up at my apartment unexpectedly, without even warning me. "They wanted to see where you live," they said, and I didn't know how to react. They walked around the rooms, looked at the furniture, asked questions about how much the rent was, how much I paid for utilities, whether the area was safe. Elma would say enthusiastically, "How nice," but her intonation clearly showed the opposite. All this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were evaluating something, as if my apartment was some kind of project for them, and not my home. When they left, I was left completely confused. Why such an interest in my life and my finances? Weeks passed, and questions multiplied in my head. I tried to distract myself, but every detail brought me back to their strange behavior. And then one day, when I came to Grandma Rosa to have tea as usual in her cozy kitchen, I noticed how her face suddenly became serious. She put her cup down and looked straight at me. "Sylvia, I have something to tell you, and you need to be prepared. You won't like it." I immediately put my mug down and felt a chill go down my spine. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked. She sighed and said, "My friend Margaret lives next door to your parents. She called me yesterday because she heard something you should know." I froze. What exactly did she hear? Grandma sighed heavily. "She was working in the garden and overheard your parents talking on the porch. They were discussing how to convince you to buy an apartment for Elma. Your father said that you were out of debt, that you were making good money, and that you didn't have a man who could spend your money. And your mother agreed and said that since you had such extra income, you were obliged to help your sister. Everything fell into place, and the puzzle came together to form the very picture I was probably afraid to see. The sudden invitations to dinner, the endless questions about my salary and career progress, their visit to my apartment, all those unkind looks and persistent questions. All this was not concern for my life, but a carefully disguised reconnaissance, an attempt to find out exactly how much money I had in order to then demand that I pay for Elma's place. "I can't believe it," I said to Grandma Rose, shaking my head. "After everything, after all these years of ignoring me and my life, now they want to use my money." Grandma put her hand on top of mine and quietly replied, "I'm so sorry, dear. I was hesitant about telling you, but I thought you had a right to know." I took a deep breath and said, "No, I'm glad you told me. Now everything is clear. Now I understand what is going on." My grandmother looked at me with concern. "What are you planning to do? I thought for a moment before answering. I'll pretend I don't know for now, but I need to make my own plan. She frowned. What plans? And then, for the first time, I said out loud what I'd been thinking about for months. My boss mentioned at work that they were planning on expanding and might be hiring for a new branch in Colorado. I think it's time to change everything and start anew. On Monday, I knocked on my boss's door. "Hi, Mike," I said as I walked in. "Remember when you said the Colorado branch might need some staff? Is the position still open?" Mike looked up from his paperwork and immediately perked up. "Let me make a few calls, but I think we can work it out." "When would you like to start?" "As soon as possible," I answered firmly, and 2 days later he confirmed. They were expecting me in Colorado for a month, with an increased salary and full compensation for the move. That same evening I went to Grandma Rosa and, sitting next to her on the sofa, said, "Colorado." She sighed heavily. "It's so far away." I squeezed her hand. "I know, Grandma, and I don't want to leave you, but I can't live here anymore and tolerate their manipulations, these endless attempts to make me pay for Elma's life. Just please don't tell anyone about this yet." Grandma nodded. "I'm keeping my mouth shut, but I'll miss you terribly." "And I will," I replied, "but we can talk on the phone, and maybe you'll come visit me someday." She hugged me tightly and said, "Do what you have to do. I'll always support you." For the next few weeks, I lived in 2 parallel worlds. I worked during the day and pretended everything was normal, and in the evenings, I quietly and carefully prepared for the move. I notified the landlord, started packing boxes, signed up with a moving company, and made sure that no one in the family noticed my preparations. Meanwhile, my parents did not let up. They kept calling and persistently inviting me to dinner, assuring me that they needed to discuss something extremely important with me. I knew what they were going to discuss, so I postponed the meeting, citing my work commitments. But finally, after 3 weeks of secret preparations, the phone rang, and my mother's voice was more decisive than usual. "Sylvia, we really need to have that dinner we talked about this weekend. It's important," I calmly replied, "I will." Saturday came, and I drove to my parents' house, knowing full well that this would likely be the last time I saw them for a long time, maybe even forever. I had already notified the landlord. Movers were scheduled to arrive Monday morning, and I had a plane ticket to Colorado on Tuesday. Elma was already sitting at the table when I walked in, practically bouncing with excitement, as if she were about to receive a special gift. My parents looked tense but determined. "Sylvia," my mother began, once we were all seated and our plates were full, "we have an important question for you." I smiled innocently, cutting into my chicken. "Okay, I'm listening." My father took over. "Elma's been looking at apartments and we found the perfect place for her." Gorgeous building, great location. Elma jumped in, beaming. "This is amazing, Sylvia. 2 bedrooms, granite countertops, a balcony overlooking the city, an in-house gym, and a rooftop terrace." I murmured, "That sounds expensive." "Well, that's the point," my mother chimed in, glancing quickly at my father. "The apartment is $350,000. We crunched the numbers and realized we didn't have the money for a down payment or a mortgage right now." "This is it," I thought, putting my fork down. And my dad continued, "We were hoping that maybe you could help Elma out. Co-sign the mortgage, or even take over the payments." I looked at them all. Elma was beaming, as if the deal had already been done. My parents were looking at me expectantly, not hiding their anticipation. I nodded slowly, as if considering it, and said, $350,000. That means monthly payments would be about $3,000. "But you make a good living now," my dad quickly added, "and you don't have any major expenses." "No student loans, no husband to pay for. You could easily afford it." The way he said it, casually, as if he were reducing my entire life to lines on a spreadsheet, almost made me lose my cool, but I summoned all my willpower to keep my cool. "You know what?" I said it quietly, but with such calm confidence that I was surprised at how calm I was, and added, smiling, "I wouldn't mind helping Elma." And at that moment, the faces of the three people in front of me seemed to light up. Their eyes were shining, their breathing quickened, a flicker of relieved greed in their gazes. "Really?" Elma squealed, clapping her hands, her voice shaking with delight, like a child who has been promised a long-awaited toy. "Oh my God, Sylvia, thank you so much. When do I need to sign the papers?" "The meeting at the bank is next Friday at 10 o'clock. Mom quickly picked up, and there was a triumphant note in her tone, as if it were already a done deal. "We'll all meet there to sign the papers." As dinner went on, Elma chattered incessantly about her future apartment, dreaming of how she would furnish the rooms, what furniture she would choose, what color the curtains would be, and how wonderful it would be to spend the evenings on the balcony overlooking the city. My parents thanked me over and over again, telling me how proud they were of my generosity and how important it was that I had finally decided to help my family. I smiled, but in my heart I felt only a cold detachment. That evening when I returned home, I finished packing the boxes. All my things were neatly packed. The documents were sorted into folders. The suitcase stood ready, as if impatiently awaiting the signal to leave. On Monday morning, the moving truck arrived right on schedule. I stood by the window and watched as the men in uniform carefully loaded my boxes, as the doors closed, and as my life in this city gradually fit into the back of the truck. As I handed over the keys to the owner of the apartment, I felt a strange lightness, as if a heavy stone had been lifted from my soul. By evening, I was already staying at a hotel near the airport, and on Tuesday morning, I was sitting on a plane heading to Colorado. The company provided me with a temporary apartment, and to my surprise, it turned out to be much more comfortable and spacious than the place where I had lived before. The first days flew by. I got to know new colleagues, looked around the office, learned to navigate a new city. And then Friday came. Exactly at 10 in the morning, my phone rang. First my mother, then my father, then Elma. One call followed another, but I just forwarded them all to voicemail. By noon, a message from my mother arrived. "Where are you?" "We are all waiting at the bank." "Sylvia, call us back immediately. You're making us look like idiots. Everyone here is waiting for you." I ignored that too, and then calmly went to lunch with the new team, laughing at my colleagues' jokes and enjoying the unfamiliar feeling of freedom. Finally, at 1 o'clock, I decided to answer. My mother's voice on the phone was shaking with anger. "Where are you?" "We're all here. We're waiting." "Oh, I've changed my mind," I said calmly. "I'm not paying Elma's rent." "Sylvia, you can't do this to us." "Actually, I can, Mom. And it's ridiculous. I'm going to come over and drag you to that bank." "Good luck to you," I laughed. "I moved to Colorado. I got transferred to a branch, and I'm starting a new life. I won't have to pay for Elma's lifestyle anymore." There was silence on the line, and Mom was speechless, but soon she screamed again. "You can't abandon your family. We need you." "No, Mom," I spoke slowly, almost softly. "You wanted my money." There's a difference. I felt my insides twist as I added. "You've spent your whole life ignoring me, treating me like I was nothing, never helping me when I needed it. And now that you need money, I'm suddenly part of the family? Number. That's not true." "That's not true. We've always taken care of you." I laughed. "That's right. That's why you skipped my graduation to go on vacation with Elma. That's why you refused to help me with my studies but took out a second mortgage for her. That's why you never called to just ask how I was doing. Sylvia, please." My mother's voice grew quieter, but I cut her off. "That's enough. Don't call me anymore." And I hung up, immediately blocking all 3 of their numbers. They tried to reach me from other phones for the next few days, writing letters, but I didn't open any of the messages. It wasn't until Grandma Rosa called that I answered, "How are you, dear?" "I'm fine, Grandma." "Really fine. How are you?" She sighed. "Your parents came by yesterday. They were furious. They wanted me to convince you to come back and help Elma." "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was their own fault. They neglected you for years, refused to help you, and now they thought you owed them hundreds of thousands of dollars. I told them they were crazy. I smiled. Good for you, Grandma. They didn't like that at all. Gustavo even told me I'd better stop hanging out with you if you weren't going to help the family. I kicked them out and told them not to come back until they apologized for all the things they did to you over the years. 6 months have passed since then. I've fallen in love with Colorado. I love my job, I've made new, wonderful friends, and I'm saving for a down payment on my own house. My grandmother visits me every few months, we talk on the phone every week, and it brings me more joy than all the years in my hometown. She told me that Elma never got that apartment and is now huddled somewhere in a rented place. My parents are still angry, but my grandmother just waves her hand. I'm tired of their selfishness. And you know, I don't miss my old life at all. For the first time in many years, I feel like I'm living for myself and not trying to earn the approval of people who never really cared about me.